Welcome to American Stories with me, your host, Amman Haider. This original HCAM series has been created to share with you the journeys of people who have come to America, overcoming personal and professional challenges, and have made a successful life for them and their families. On this program, we will hear what they've experienced, learn how they've thrived, and what they have given back to the country and communities they live in and work in. Joining me today is my guest, Mohamed Haider. Mohamed, welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So, Mohamed, you're a successful engineer. You are married to a scientist. You're an entrepreneur. You serve on several nonprofit organizations. And to throw it in, you also have a collection of fancy cars. So you have come a long way. But let's go back in time and tell me a little bit about your childhood. Where were you born and what kind of childhood you had?
Sure. So I was born in Pakistan. At a young age, moved to the UK because both my parents were doctors. At a certain stage in life, my grandfather retired. My dad was the only son. And in our culture, the eldest son takes care of the parents. So we moved back to Pakistan. And my father and mother, both being doctors, were expecting their firstborn child to follow in their footsteps and also become a doctor. My mind was always very much engineering focused, very, very much so. And it was a challenge coming from our culture to explain to your parents that science is not everything, right? There are other career fields to get into. After going through my O-levels and A-levels, which is common, it's a British system in Pakistan. After that, I was able to convince my mother, at least, that engineering was the path that I wanted to take. She went to my dad and convinced him that, you know, this kid is not science focused.
Yeah.
Let him go into engineering. And then I was able to come to the US to attend college and start my undergrad.
So what actually prompted you to step into engineering, just out of curiosity?
So I've always been a math geek, so to speak. Throughout college, I was the geek. And I've always had a fascination with being able to creatively solve problems. And in sciences, there's pretty much only one way that blood flows through a heart.
Right.
There's only one way that a lung operates. But I've always wanted to be creative in how I solve a problem. And getting to the same destination, but with a different path.
Yeah.
And that's sort of what prompted me to get into engineering. And I've just loved it.
Yeah. It's interesting because, I mean, I know you come from a house full of doctors and, and you just sort of branched off in engineering. So do you have anything interesting to share about your childhood while you were in Pakistan and when you were in England?
So growing up in England, I did my primary education. And it was interesting because at that point in time, my dad, we were the only brown family in town. So it was a very difficult childhood because you always had to be on best behavior. Because if anything went wrong, they knew that you were the brown kid and you were the doctor's kid.
Right.
So news got back to your mother before you could pedal back home if you did something wrong.
Wow.
So that was challenging. Moving back to Pakistan, then obviously you're coming from a different environment.
Right.
You're coming from a British culture, and you come back to Pakistan with a funny accent. Right? And people look at you like, okay, where are you from? You don't sound like us.
Right.
You look like us, but you don't sound like us. And then trying to assimilate again, right? So going through two different steps of assimilation, I think, was a challenge. And then from there, coming to the US was another assimilation that you had to go through. But all in all, every experience has taught me different things, and that has sort of helped me be who I am today.
So the few years that you spent in Pakistan, tell me about it. How was it in growing up in Pakistan? I mean, it was a very different environment then, compared to the days we're living now. So, what did you enjoy growing up? And
back then, life was simpler. Rules when we were growing up was basically get home before sunset. And there was implicit trust in your friends. There was implicit trust in that you wouldn't get into any trouble, quote unquote, right? So I think life back then was much easier. In my house growing up, education was the primary focus. So for both of my parents and my grandparents, grades were it. And your privileges were granted to you based on your grades. which is very different from how life is nowadays. Nowadays, there's more of you are given privileges, but there's not as much emphasis on your education, so to speak, or where are you going, what are you doing. There's a lot more freedom and liberties, and I think that alone, having that network at home of the implicit trust, gave you the liberty and the freedom to experience things the way you wanted to, but within predefined boundaries, so to speak. So that, I think, has made a big influence as well, because you sort of tested the waters, but you also knew that if I did something wrong, there were repercussions behind it.
So you brought up a good point. Like back then, there was a lot of emphasis on grades and education,
Yes.
and we're talking quite a few years ago.
Right.
But what I've noticed here, and I've spoken to my previous guests too, that immigrants who have moved to the U.S., there's still a big focus on grades. And
Yes.
why is this? I mean, we've passed 20, 30 years, but there's still a focus on, especially immigrants coming here. Why do you think that is happening?
The reason for that is because when we are growing up, the educational component is ground into us. Our parents always want us to be more successful than they were. And that is in our culture too, where I feel that my kids have to be more successful than me.
Right.
And if they're able to do better than I'm doing, then I've completed my parental responsibilities. And it's so much part of our culture, if you will, that we ingrain it in our kids, and we hope that the next generations follow along the same path.
Interesting. Very interesting. So let's go back. While growing up, who do you think was probably the most influential person who put an impact on your life?
That's a difficult question, because at every stage of my life, I've had different mentors, if you will. So growing up, for example, in my younger years, my paternal grandfather was my biggest influence. Very calm, collected person, extremely intelligent, in his time. He played a big role during my high school years. When I was in college, it was my English professor. Out of all the professors in the world, it was an English professor.
Okay.
But then when I started working, I was fortunate enough to have a first boss who was able to recognize the potential in me and helped me break out of my shell. So he forced me into situations that were uncomfortable. And half the time I would think he doesn't like me, which is why he's pushing me into the stuff that I really don't want to do.
Right.
But now that I look back, every step that he saw, and every step he made, was in my best interest. And he exposed me to so many different things. So it's very hard for me to give you one person, because every stage of my life, there have been different people who have helped groom me, mentor me, and develop into the person I am today.
So, so after high school in Pakistan, you decided to come to the United States for college. Why did you choose the U.S. to come here? And my second part of the question is, where did you go to college?
So my focus when I finished high school, was electrical and computer engineering. And at that time, the U.S. was the leader in electrical and computer engineering jobs and education. So that sort of prompted me to come to the U.S.
Okay.
My dad said the same thing. He said, you know, if you want to go into engineering, the U.S. is it. Don't look anywhere else. Mm-hmm. So I ended up at Drexel in Philadelphia. So, and to give an example of my geekiness, I graduated with a double major and a double minor in 4 years.
Wow.
So I was the geek in college. Yeah. I was everyone's tutor when it came to math problems.
Wow, very interesting. So, so after you graduated from college, where did you start your career, and how did it follow you till today?
So that's where the American system has helped me out a lot. Mm-hmm. So when I came to Drexel, it was primarily because there was an attraction of being a co-op.
Okay.
It was 1 year, 6 months in school, 6 months working. And I felt that because my parents were more on the medical side, it was very hard to find someone to be a mentor in the engineering sector. Mm-hmm. So going to Drexel helped me because I was able to experience what it would be like to be an engineer. So when I did my first co-op, I worked for a company in Northeast Pennsylvania.
Okay.
I did one co-op. I liked it. We got along. They were satisfied with my work. They brought me back for the second co-op cycle. After the second cycle, there was a third one that was supposed to happen. But they ended up offering me a job after the second one. And I went to my boss, who then became my mentor, and said, John, I still have a year and a half to go yet in school. He says, no, don't worry. We'll hold a spot for you.
Wow.
And that, to me, was eye-opening.
Yeah.
And there was no written documentation. It was a handshake agreement. So he said, just come back and see me when you graduate. So March of that year, when I was graduating, I went up in my suit and tie for my interview, and I show up and I'm sitting outside John's office. He looks at me and he says, why are you all dressed up? I said, well, you said to come back in March, to talk about the job. And he says, you already have the job. I just want to know if you're taking it or not.
Wow. Wow.
So that person was then my mentor.
Wow.
And he, out of all the folks I've worked for, he was one of the smartest individuals because he could assess people's qualities, which people themselves did not recognize.
Wow.
And he was able to instill that in me, that I can talk to people and figure out where would they be a good fit and help groom those people moving forward.
I think, I mean, you are definitely very fortunate to have someone like this in your earlier career. But what were some of the challenges that you did face in the early years in your career, and what do you do to overcome them?
So the first challenge, obviously, was coming to the U.S. and being here alone.
Yeah.
I had an uncle and aunt in New York, but nobody immediately close by. So getting used to the culture, the school systems, how things work, obviously takes a toll on you.
Right.
And it's a learning experience. After that, getting into the workforce was also a challenge because in my day, I was the only brown person in the company. There was nobody else. So I always felt that you were held to a higher standard than others. And maybe that was my own doing. Maybe I felt, because my parents were so successful in their careers, that I had to hold myself to a higher standard. And that, I think, was a self-imposed challenge.
Wow.
Maybe others didn't see it that way.
So, so those are your early years in Pennsylvania. And then you moved to Massachusetts and Sturbridge.
Yes.
And you lived there for quite a few years. And I think you just recently moved to Hopkinton in 2000 and
May of 2018.
2018, right? So here you are in Hopkinton, and you're a successful manager. Everything's going well. So what actually prompted you to step in as an entrepreneur? And I believe that you have recently partnered in the healthcare space.
Yes.
So talk a little bit more about that. And
so one thing that I realized throughout my working career is that companies typically lack the mentorship for the youth.
Okay.
Basically, the youth are left to do whatever you want to do, which is a decent approach, but sometimes you don't know what you don't know. And the other thing that I noticed is that not everybody is fortunate enough to have the money to go to college. So I started volunteering in a couple of nonprofits. One of them does interest-free loans for kids who want to go to college. There are certain requirements, grades, etc., etc. Then I volunteer for another group out of Boston called Open, which is a collective of Pakistani entrepreneurs. And our focus is to mentor the youth. It doesn't matter where you come from, what your background is, but we help mentor youth. And youth meaning not people in high school, but folks who are in college, or folks who are in college or have left college and are looking to start their own businesses. So we help them for sales, business development, marketing activities. The other thing that I looked into, obviously in Hopkinton, I'm on the town committee, one of the town committees, Capital Improvement Committee. Only been to one meeting, but I'm hoping to be able to contribute. That comes very much from the be local, buy local attitude.
Right.
So you see that in the news all the time, be local, buy local, right? The same thing, I think, if you live in a certain community, you should volunteer in that community because that has more of an impact on everyone's lives. You're a fish in a smaller pond, so to speak, by being local. The healthcare space, that started out of,
Do you mind,
sorry.
let me just pause you for a second. So going back to, you know, I mean, you are involved in several nonprofits, but you being successful as it is right now, and I'm sure, I don't know how much time you have to give back, but why is it important to give back to the communities that you live in and that people actually need the help and support?
So you've heard a famous phrase, it takes a village to raise a child.
Yep. Yep.
That's very much where the volunteer part comes in. You can leave people alone and let them struggle. So when we come over as immigrants, we struggle through the whole process. Whether we admit it or not, we do struggle.
Right.
Some of us say, oh, it was fine, I had no challenge. But we all have some struggles along the way. And it could be for various reasons. It could be you're homesick. It could be that you just don't feel like you fit in. But it's very important, I feel, to volunteer and help the younger generation and help them avoid some of the struggles that you've been through. Because your experiences in volunteering make a bigger impact on communities and on the younger generation or even the elderly population, as opposed to getting paid for it. Because when someone is paying you for it, it's expected you will do it.
Right.
When you're volunteering, people take that approach much differently. They now feel that you are genuinely interested in that person's well-being, which is why you're volunteering.
Right. Yeah.
And that's why I do volunteer in 3 or 4 different organizations. I try to pick ones which can take advantage of my skills. I don't volunteer just for the fun of it and for being a resume builder.
Right.
I volunteer because I genuinely feel that I can help in some small way.
Wow. Very interesting. So let's talk a little bit about Mohamed, the entrepreneur. So you had mentioned that you had recently partnered with someone in the healthcare space. So talk a little bit about the you know, how you're involved and what the nature of the business is.
So when COVID started back in March of 2020, you obviously started noticing people were having issues coping with the separation from friends or separation from families. So a friend and I got together and said, how can we help people in this time? Now, you can give people jobs and you can put them back to work. There's a lot of different things. But when we started to look around and started to talk, we realized that people are being emotionally, mentally affected by the separation. Right. So the two of us got together, and there was a doctor in a neighboring town who was retiring. We took over his healthcare business. So he's a psychiatrist. So we ended up opening 2 psych offices, one in Natick, one in Milford. We're looking at opening up a couple more in the area. And it's more of being able to provide the services that people so desperately need. We do have people that come in that sometimes can't afford to pay, and that's okay. You always have people who need the help but may not be able to afford it. So we do have programs where we help those specific individuals. But it all goes back to the thought process of you have to help others. Just because you've had good luck doesn't mean everybody else has. And if you can help a person through a particular challenge using your skill set, it's great. One thing I've told people is you're driving down the road and you see a construction worker. The poor guy's there holding that stop sign, right? And he's helping you get through this intersection of this challenge. Smile and wave at the guy. It doesn't cost you anything.
Right.
And you've just made someone's day that you're recognizing that this person is out there, 100-degree weather, helping you navigate in your luxury car through a difficult intersection.
Very interesting. Right. So, you know, I usually ask, and I always talk to my friends and family that, you know, America is still the land of opportunities. But given the current day and age that we're living in, do you think that opportunities actually, they're knock on your doors, or is this something that you have to pursue?
Opportunities are something that you have to pursue. Not all of us are lucky enough where they actually come and fall at our feet. So you have to work for things. And that is something that as you start to work with the younger generation, you realize that, my case in point, right, for example, because I had certain challenges through life, I never wanted my kids to face those challenges. So I sometimes feel maybe I made their lives too easy,
Mm-hmm.
where maybe they should have gone through some of the problems. It's like I remember when growing up, my dad used to say, "Oh, I had to walk 10 miles a day to go to school. I had to walk 10 miles a day." Like, okay, Dad, yeah, But when you go to
Yeah.
college and it's the middle of winter and you
Yeah.
don't have a car and you are walking 2 or 3 blocks in the snow, you realize, wow, I'm just doing 2 blocks. My
Yeah.
dad walked 10 miles.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hypothetically speaking, 10 miles. But for our kids, the bus stop is 20 feet from the house. We'll put them in the car and drive them to that 10 feet because it's too cold.
Too cold. Yeah.
So I think people are, we're taking life for granted. We need to step back and smell the roses, right? And see.
But so now that you mentioned that, we have someone who is just starting out his career. You know, he just graduated from college. He wants to start his career. What would your advice be to him?
Find a good mentor.
Okay.
Mentorship, people underestimate the value of mentorship. Finding a good professional mentor, there you can't put a price on it. And there are so many people out there in different communities who are more than willing to help people out. You just have to reach out to them.
Yeah. Yeah. So, given your time in the U.S., when have you been most satisfied living your life in the U.S.?
I would say that both of my children graduating college was a major milestone because coming from our culture, education is a primary importance. But if I take a step further, when both of my kids said, "Dad, we want to go for a master's program," that was the highlight.
Wow.
And that's when my wife and I said, "Okay, if they want to go and they need help, we'll help pay for it."
Yeah. Yeah.
Because they themselves were recognizing that they had to take the initiative. We can't just keep pushing them along and saying, "Why don't you apply here? Why don't you apply there?"
Right.
When they did it themselves and they realized that this is important. And I think at that point, the kids recognized what we as parents have done by coming to the U.S. And we have given them the opportunities that they have now. We took a lot of sacrifices for them.
Yeah.
And now they're recognizing it. And they recognize it in a way by saying, we want to enhance our career. We want to go into a master's program. We want to do this. And luckily, I'm fortunate that my son does volunteer in some things already.
Very good.
So he's already recognized the importance of giving back to the community at the age of 24, 25.
Very good. Yeah. So let's compare lifestyles for a second. So today, here you are, and Mohamed as you know, a successful person who's moved to the U.S. But today, if you're living in Pakistan, having a successful life in Pakistan, and given the current environment, that's what's happening around in that region,
Right.
Would you still consider coming to America in this time and age, or would you be content and happy living there?
That's a difficult question to answer because circumstances change. I think growing up here, growing up as in going through college, etc., has been more fulfilling of an experience. And I think it has made me a better person because I had mentors who recognized. In Pakistan, the challenge is the mentorship part of it.
Yeah.
We don't see a lot of it. We see a lot of community work. We see a lot of people giving back to communities. But we don't see a lot of mentorship. It's basically you're on your own, figure it out. So going back to your question, if I had the decision to make as to would I be in Pakistan or would I be here, I firmly believe I would still be here.
Okay. Yeah. So, given your success in life, how would you describe yourself in probably one word, and why would you?
Tenacious. When I want something, I go after
You go
it.
after it. Yeah.
And there are always going to be hurdles. There are always going to be roadblocks. There's always going to be challenges. But you can't sit back and say, "Oh my God, what do I do
Absolutely.
now?" Case in point, March of 2012, I was working for a company, and I had a tiff with my boss. And I had a couple of choices to make. And one of the choices was, to blame my boss or throw him under the bus, so to speak. One was that I sign up for something that I know I can't deliver on. Number three was just quit gracefully and move on. And I chose the option to quit. And it was, I remember very well, my wife, I told one of my friend told his wife told my wife. And every day my wife is saying, hey, do you have something to tell me? I said, no, I don't. And after 2 days, she says, so-and-so called me and said, you quit your job. I said, yes, I did. She says, why didn't you tell me? It was a bump in my life, and I was okay with my decision. Maybe people didn't think it was a smart idea, but I was okay with it. But taking that time off gave me the time to reflect and see, where am I now? This is the turning point. Where do I want to go next? But I had the luxury, because I lived in the US, I had the luxury of being able to take that pause and that break.
Very good.
If I were in Pakistan, I don't think I could have done that. I don't think I could have taken that break. And I was thankful I didn't have to fall back on unemployment or Social Security, anything of that sort, right? But I did well enough that I was able to sustain myself.
Wow, very interesting. Well, Mohamed, unfortunately, I'd love to talk to you more about it, but we're approaching the tail end of the show. So I want to heartily thank you very much for being on the show. And thank you, Mohamed, for spending this time sharing the story with us. And I also like to thank you for watching our series. I hope you have enjoyed our learning about Mohamed's journey. And to learn more about our show, please visit our webpage. I would love to hear your comments and reactions to our show, and your contact information is on that page. Until next time, for American Stories, I'm Amman Haider, and I wish you safe travels. God bless.